Hello and welcome to the Corelosophy Podcast. This is Chris Muntz, and this is a special edition of the podcast in a variety of ways. This is going to be ad-free. It's also going to be something that is going to be accessible to anyone of any profession. That is not a music-specific podcast, but choir people, don't run off. These issues and these topics are relevant to all of us, to everyone as we encounter each other online, in real life, in our classrooms, in our professional environments. When we work with each other, when we communicate with each other in any way, we use rhetoric. Now, whether we use good rhetoric or toxic rhetoric is a choice that we have to make. But step one is understanding how rhetoric functions, how it can be used to manipulate, and how it can also be used to persuade, and the good things that we use our language and our communication for. So I have a special guest in this episode, Dr. Erec Smith from York College, who is going to give us his expert take on how he sees some of the rhetoric that has become very toxic. And you all know what I'm talking about. It's the fact that we can't seem to go on Facebook and drop a thread in there without getting in a fight with somebody. Right? This is not a normal state of affairs. And so I've got some ideas about how I think this is playing out. But I asked Dr. Smith to come on as well. But before we get to that, I want to get a few ideas out there to set the stage for this conversation. This is the first post that I have made on Corelosophy, where I have also written a blog that goes with this episode. This blog is my personal exploration of this topic of toxic rhetoric online. And I've been making some Facebook posts about it lately, but this is kind of me getting all my thoughts together in one place, talking to an expert about it in the podcast, but then also supplementing that with a blog. So I encourage you to check that out. In the blog, I have a section called The Anatomy of an Explosive Comment Thread. I also have rhetorical analysis, I guess you could say, of the term tone policing, which I think is one that gets thrown around a lot. And so I have my take in the blog as well on that. But I do think, write, and speak quite a bit about how the quality of conversation has been negatively affected by the influence of social media. Namely, my observation is that the fights that I observe, and that's fights in quotes, or that people try to pick with me, seem to follow the same rhetorical patterns that just happen over and over and over. And they are exacerbated by social media and its manipulation of some of our bad mental habits. Now, this is not my theory by myself. I come to this conclusion that we are being manipulated by a lot of research and a lot of listening to people who know what they're talking about. If you have not yet seen The Social Dilemma, this would be a good place for you to start in understanding what it is that I'm talking about. But I've gathered some human psychological processes that the social media apps actively manipulate, as in they know they're doing it. The companies know that these are things that will make them more money if they push the buttons that we have, that psychologists that they've hired as consultants have told them that if they push those buttons, then they will make more money. Okay, so here's one. The availability heuristic, which is a term that means that if you see the bad thing constantly on your phone or on TV, your brain places it in a category that is the same as existential danger. So the same category that, a lion that's about to eat you. The thing may be very real and very bad, but it's not as prevalent as the phone makes it seem. So in other words, if you pick up your phone and you see mention of that bad thing for, 8 or 9 hours in a row, it might insert into your brain a bias that thing is super prevalent, as in it happens all the time. Another one is called anchoring bias. The first context you see something in, or the first fact you see, is disproportionately hard to shake when new info arrives. Just not too long ago, in fact, the most recent episode I put out, I did some promotional material on that post, and I put a quote from the episode out there, and it got me into a big old rigmarole on a thread where again, think about how Facebook works. When you see a notification in your feed, right, in your phone, pops up and it says that someone said a comment on this thread, and you see that little notification bell. And you probably, of course, know that one of your friends is going to make a comment because they're on your team in whatever issue it is that you're passionate about. And so you're going to want to know what that person said, right? So you click on that, rather than having that notification when you click on it take you to the top of the feed, forcing you to first encounter the intended context and then forcing you to read down through the conversation that has already occurred. It doesn't do that. It takes you right to where your friend entered the conversation, which means that you come in to the conversation with an anchoring bias that is not the intended context. Okay, so you come into the midpoint of a conversation seeing only the new context. And if that context that you've been given is negative towards the original poster, in this case, it was me, then it's going to be very hard for you to accept the fact that it's possible that you are not using the correct interpretation of that post. So this happens all the time. In fact, I would invite you to notice that now as you look at your phone, when you get those notifications that your friend is in a conversation, notice where it drops you in that feed. It drops you right off where your friend left the feed, which means that you are missing a ton of context when you enter that conversation. Another one is called the audience effect, which is that every interaction is perverted by an audience online because the conversations are not between two people. They are between two people with an audience, which means both participants in the conversation feel a very strong need to pull to perform. It becomes disproportionately important to us to appear to be a good member of our team. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to be seen as attacking the other team. And then fourth one, and I've got in the blog a link to a scholarly article on this one, which is called The Paradox of Morality, and some research that shows that those who are sincerely, who want to do the right thing and want to be seen as moral are actually more likely to lie and cover their moral lapses, and thus become less moral. But those people who care less about how they appear to others may actually be more honest about their moral feelings and thus become more moral. Now, this is just my guess, but I think most people don't want to imagine themselves as susceptible to such petty manipulation. Most people read this stuff or they hear this stuff and they think, yeah, I see other people definitely fall prey to this stuff. This is a problem for other people. That is for sure. And here's the point of the episode. No. If that's your reaction, then you are the problem. I know that might seem harsh, but we are all susceptible to this. Every single person is susceptible to this, which is why I struggle so much online to understand the perspective of a person who speaks as if they know everything that they are saying is righteous and right. Because we are all susceptible to those types of moral biases those cognitive biases, right? So this episode with Dr. Smith is really a kind of a deep dive into some of the things that he sees online. Of course, one of the things that he's passionate about is the way that we have a conversation about race, the way that we talk about it. Again, that's important. That's what this episode is all about. It's not whether or not someone should talk about race or whether or not someone should go online and talk about, saving the whales, or whether or not someone should have their issue that they are passionate about be gender and trans rights, or of course the environment. Maybe there's equity in schooling. There are all kinds of things that you could be passionate about. That's not the point of this episode. The point of this episode is not to judge your cause. The point of the episode is to think deeply about the way we talk about our cause, because the mediums that we choose now in social media is such a great technological advancement in that we can reach so many people with what we are saying, which means that the way we say it becomes even more important. Lastly, before we go into the interview, I will say that probably one of the most interesting things about doing this show is because we lean in to sensitive conversations. I actually, you hear we got to have the uncomfortable conversations. Sometimes I wonder if people actually mean that, because that's something that I do hear. I will talk to you. I will talk to anyone about anything, and that's sometimes uncomfortable. But the reason that is interesting to me is because by doing that, I've been getting a ton of feedback, and the one thing that I've noticed is that most of the feedback is private. Meaning a lot of people feel like they're interested in supporting what it is that I do here on the show, but don't feel like they can say it publicly, which I'm concerned about, because I think that all ties into these toxic rhetorics that we are exploring in this episode. So I hope you enjoy. Stick around and listen to my conversation with Dr. Erec Smith. And of course, don't forget to check out the blog in the show notes. Okay, everybody, I'm here with Dr. Erec Smith. Eric and I are going to talk about what I think. Now, I'm just a layperson in this area, but Eric is a professor of rhetoric, and I am a layperson fan of rhetoric. I've been studying about it, reading about it my whole life, really. I had a really awesome English language arts teacher who exposed me to it back in high school. And I've been just kind of interested in it, but it's also one of those things that most people don't know what it actually is. And I believe could be a incredibly powerful tool for anyone who instructs, who teaches, who speaks, whose job it is to communicate ideas to people. They really need to understand what rhetoric is. So I have asked an expert. We're going to talk about that and many other things. So, Dr. Smith, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, why don't you first introduce yourself to my audience and just tell us a little bit about how you got to be doing what you're doing. Even if you want to go back to little Erec, how does little Erec become a professor of rhetoric?
Wow. There's a lot going on between little Eric and when I decided to get a PhD in rhetoric. I mean, it involves being ostracized from not one but two different circles of people.
Tell us about that.
It involves Jim Morrison. It involves Eastern philosophy and Taoism and Buddhism, which I'm still interested in today. It involves a lot of people, a lot of things. So it's a long story. I think you just said to talk about the ostracization.
Yeah, what is that? How does that get you to be a professor?
Well, I've talked about this in a couple of podcasts now, so it's becoming a theme. But I grew up in a predominantly white area, and it was kind of there. And I talk about this. There's a TED Talk-esque video out there in which I talk about this. But it was the '80s. And people weren't as open-minded as they are now. I mean, it wasn't Jim Crow by any means; it was Jersey. But still, they made it clear that I wasn't supposed to be there. But after graduating 8th grade, I realized I can go to we were all going to the regional high school, which was much more diverse. It was literally 50% Black. And I said, oh, finally, my people. I can go and finally fit in. I don't have to deal with this anymore. Everything's going to open up. The clouds are going to part. Sun's going to come down. It's going to be wonderful. And I met them, and it took about a week and a half for them to realize that I was too white for them, having been socially constructed in a predominantly white neighborhood for the first 14 and a half years of my life. So I realized that I was a person without a niche, without a clique. And that made me figure out, okay, what makes a clique? How do people get together? Why do cliques even have to exist? Why can't everybody just coexist? And what's keeping people from accepting people for who they are and things like that? The word rhetoric wasn't on my radar at the time.
Right.
Nor the word discourse, ideology and things like that. But I'd come later on. I'm going to skip all the other stuff I mentioned.
No, it's okay. I was going to ask if I could just kind of guess. I've seen some of the stuff you've done, but I don't know for sure. But I'm going to guess that the foreshadowing of your current career was that. Do you feel like looking back on that, the reason you were signaled as not part of the clique was because you spoke differently?
Yeah, that's part of it. But it wasn't just speaking. It abides by what the social linguist James G. calls discourse, right? I mean, a lot of people call it discourse, but his definition is pertinent because he describes it as not just the values, attitudes, and beliefs and ways of speaking we have, but it goes as far as body positions, interest, things like that, clothing even, right? So my discourse was not their discourse.
Right.
My values were not their values.
So beyond just the way you speak vocally, your vocalization, it's the other ways of communicating also, body language even.
Right,
Okay.
right. Other
Yep.
ways of communicating, other interests, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. So I mean, for example, I mean, this is something small, but I mean, it's an example. I once told a joke that was an Eddie Murphy joke, which I loved Eddie Murphy at the time, and I told it because it was relevant to the conversation and things like that, and they laughed. And I said, "Well, I mean, it wasn't my joke; it was Eddie Murphy, right?" And they were like, "Why are you telling us that?" Like I'm a big fan of giving credit where credit is due. I guess I'm a professor now and I teach citing things. So I guess, that stuck with me. But to them, it was like, you don't do that. Just tell the joke, and that's not necessarily a black or white thing.
Right.
It's just an example of, what I valued versus what they value.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
so, um, yeah, things like that. But so anyway, I got into thinking about you know discourse before I knew what discourse was, right? And eventually, the universe led me to certain places, and I realized what I wanted to do, and that was study rhetoric, which is the study of discourses and language and belief systems and how they're built on language and things like that. So that's why I'm here.
That's an amazing story. You were kind of it sounds like you were kind of placed in a situation where in order to figure out your life, you had to you kind of had this curiosity instilled that made you go to that next step, which was the academic route and studying all of these different types of discourses and rhetoric. So one of the things, this is I'll start with this, kind of digging us into the meat of this, which as the expert on the topic, what even is rhetoric? How would you define it?
There are so many definitions of rhetoric. One of the first things I do in class with my students, if the class is about rhetoric, is go over several different definitions of rhetoric and ask them what they think of each one and which one makes the most sense and things like that. I won't go through all those. Um, but I will say the most common and simplest definition comes from Aristotle, who said that rhetoric is the ability to discern in any given situation the available means of persuasion, right? So, available means, what does that mean? If you have the same message, right, but you're in a bar, you're going to say it differently than you are if you're in church, right?
Yep.
There are different means of persuasion available to you in church that aren't in a bar and vice versa, right? So the ability to gauge your situation, realize what the best way to speak is to be as persuasive as possible, that's rhetoric. That's the simple definition of it. Rhetoric can be used to build belief systems, nationhoods, things like that. It builds discourses, obviously. It convinces people of which values to hold most dear, what attitudes to embrace, what beliefs to have, right? So it's a very powerful thing.
So oftentimes you hear the two terms logic and rhetoric placed together, kind of the part of the the classical education trivium,
Mhm.
right? And so is there in your work, is there a connection between rhetoric and logic? Do you teach courses on both? Do you involve both in courses? How does that work for you?
I involve both in courses. In fact, logos is the term. It's one of the rhetorical appeals, along with ethos, which is credibility, virtue, and pathos, which is emotion. So those two combined with logos make up rhetoric. So if you're going to be persuasive, you have to ideally you'd have all three, but you're going to emphasize one or two over the other based on the situation.
Hmm.
You talked about logic before. Logos, logic, has what's called the topics of invention, which is ways of formulating arguments or statements, ready-made ways, right? Some people, William James has a version of this, which he just calls common sense, right? And basically, it's a way of okay, I want to talk about this certain thing. How do I broach it? So there's definition, I'll just define it and go through all the aspects of the definition. There's compare and contrast. I'll say what it's like and what it isn't like, right? Degrees, I'll say that it's better than this and worse than this. There are all these different kinds of ways of talking about the same thing. So you discern the best one for the situation and you act accordingly. And all those things are already like there for you to just plug your information into, kind of like a wacky, nerdy Mad Lib.
Right. Now I've always felt that the reason I asked that question ultimately was that I've always felt like teachers in more broadly would benefit from making rhetoric in that broader sense that you described, the type that includes concepts of logic, concepts of credibility, all those types of things, but especially the idea that that expanding your own search, I guess, as a communicator for the different routes of persuasion that are available to you would be a dramatic shift in the way we teach. Because I'm not sure if you've ever felt this or not, but concepts of logic, rhetoric, those types of things were taught more formally to more students if you go back 50 years, 75
Oh, yeah.
years. Do you ever lament the fact that that's not part of normal public education?
Yes and no.
Okay. Tell us about that.
Well, okay. Yes, because I'm totally over the teaching of literature. I'm not interested in it anymore. I like literature.
Okay.
I love it, actually, but I don't want to teach it.
Interesting. Okay.
Not because I mean, it's literary criticism. I want to criticize the world. My book is out there. So I want to do a rhetorical analysis of what's going on and things like that. I think it's closer to what matters in the immediate sense. I'm not downplaying literary criticism or the teaching of literature. It's just not my thing.
Oh, I agree with you. We'll get there.
Okay. So for that reason, yeah. But also, I mean, there was a time when rhetoric was the English part. I mean, that's what it was, and it's therefore it wasn't special. So I like the fact that it's relatively special right now. And,
Interesting. So in today's world, there is a place for a rhetoric specific professor simply because, if you go back 100 years ago, those concepts would have been incorporated into the English department. Is that, am I understanding that correctly? Okay.
Well, 150.
Oh, okay. So go back further. Right. Okay. So that makes sense. So there was at one point a time where if you were teaching English, you would have been teaching English in the sense that here's how you use English to communicate, because that's the language you speak, but here's how you would use that language to communicate more effectively, to become more persuasive, to tell a better story, to write a better book, to give a better speech. Am I getting that? I'm kind of
Yes.
Okay. Do you feel like people in general nowadays are communicating well? I'm assuming you don't, or else you wouldn't be concerned about what's going on out in the world.
No, I don't think they're communicating well, but I think they're not communicating well because they have different values. We talked about values, attitudes, and beliefs before.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are people out there who, and this is moral foundations theory, which is a psychological theory, but it makes a lot of sense if you think about discourse and rhetoric. Everybody shares the same values. They just emphasize some over others, right? So if you emphasize authority and somebody else emphasizes liberty, you may butt heads. You both like those values, but you emphasize one more than another. What's more, if you emphasize loyalty and your other friend emphasizes honesty, and a third friend tells you that he just robbed a bank, you're going to keep a secret. But the other guy is like, wait a minute, this is wrong. If somebody asks me what happens, I'm going to have to tell the truth because I emphasize honesty. Right. Yeah. So then, values butt heads there as well. So the key, obviously, is to be as open-minded as possible when when discussing things and explaining, what you value and why you value it, while realizing that you still have those values in common. You still appreciate them. You just emphasize some over others. The ability to find common ground is becoming a lost art.
Yeah.
Because we look at people and assume that we don't have common ground, or we, look at people's beliefs and things like that, and we say that's way too antithetical to mine, without realizing that there may be some other common ground that can start a conversation and get us on the right page.
Mm-hmm.
We're not doing that. It's becoming, as you've probably heard already, more tribal in the country. Tribalism is taking over. This is my group and that's your group. And in order to take pride in my group, I'm going to distance myself from your group as far as I can.
Right.
And it seems to be the trend right now.
Yeah, no, of course I see that too. And one of the things that I wonder is, at least my theory, is that social media contributes to that, and not in that it creates the problem, but it takes the problem and causes it to be able to, almost thinking, I'm picturing like the borders drawn between two tribes. Social media can take that border and extend it everywhere. Um, and so that kind of incentivizes us to draw those lines even deeper, because we can pull people to our side that maybe they're across the globe. And 50 years ago, you could only pull to your side the people who were in the conversation physically.
Right.
Is that something that you see as kind of toxic to rhetoric?
Well, definitely, because the whole point of rhetoric is that there are people out there who don't agree with you or don't see things your way. So you use rhetoric to help them see things your way. In order to have rhetoric make sense, you have to have people with various viewpoints.
Mm-hmm.
Social media, what that does is create echo chambers where everybody thinks the same, for more or less, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to persuade or use language to persuade atrophies, right? So when you do hear somebody saying something different, you're more inclined to attack them,
Right.
right? And quote them, call them crazy or stupid or evil, even, right? As opposed to using your ability to persuade, to talk to them, right, and see why they're thinking what they think, and hopefully they can do the same. That skill is going away because people are so locked in their echo chambers, they don't need it. They feel like they don't need that skill.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about, even the way you explain discourse from your childhood story, where other things than just the basics of language are at play in discourse. You've got the body language, you've got the tone of voice, you've got how loud or soft someone says something, whether or not there's a slight turn of the side of their lip when they say something, so that they're kind of being a little bit facetious or tongue in cheek, or a lot of that stuff is lost in on social media. And so I think we don't, when I asked about if you think it's toxic to rhetoric, I think what I mean really is it's reducing our ability to communicate to a point where, yes, we can say more things that will reach more people, but it's low resolution communication, where the only thing that person who's reading it can get is they can get a picture of my profile picture, where they can see my skin color, right? So they can assume a bunch of things about me there, and then they can read the text, say on a tweet or on a Facebook post, and that's all they get. Whereas in a conversation with actual human people, you tend to be able to communicate with this kind of full array of all of the things you described, of all the aspects of discourse. And so in a lot of ways, we're having to relearn, maybe as a human species, how to communicate.
There, it's kind of a different discourse community
Hmm.
on social media. So you're in essence kind of invisible. So you ever imagine how you would act if you had the power of invisibility? and you do all kinds of things you wouldn't do if people were seeing you.
Right.
Something like that tends to happen online. What's more, the other people out there are kind of invisible as well and almost not real. And if somebody's not real, then you don't feel bad doing things to them that you would to somebody immediately in front of you who is real. Judith Butler calls this like derealizing somebody, right? This person isn't a person anymore. It's some kind of entity, some avatar online. What's more, there's a psychologist, I believe, Jonathan Suler, who and I get this term from him, solipsistic introjection. What that means is that you can read something, like somebody can say like, "Oh, what a beautiful day it is outside. I want to go for a walk," and you read, "What a beautiful day. Maybe I'll go for a walk." So you read it sarcastically, but he didn't mean it that way, right? You're projecting a tone of voice onto that other person. Solipsistic introjection. All these things get in the way of direct and effective communication. I think social media is one of the worst things that ever happened to humanity. I think we were not ready for social media, especially Web 2.0. Anyway, that was like giving a gun to a toddler, and we kind of abused it. It has a lot of good things, right?
Right.
And it was supposed to be this great boon for humanity, right? This great boon for democracy. And 30 years later, we're just swiping left and right and mobbing people.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't,
Yeah, I think we are learning when we're online, we're learning how easy it is to put people into boxes, non-human boxes, kind of political abstraction boxes,
right.
where we can see, like I said before, you can see an avatar of their face, and you can see a few words they say. And I have some rhetorical theories too there about just people read even just the syntax that you type, and they will assume which political side you're on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll take an example. One of the things I noticed right away is that if someone in my social media circle is a left-leaning person, then they will refer to the mortality statistic of COVID as a percentage of people who will die. Right. So they would use they would choose to frame it in terms of a percentage of people who might die. If you are a right-wing person in my social media feed, you will frame it as a percentage of people who will survive. And it became super obvious, like even just that one thing. I know if someone says 98% survivable, they're a right-winger. And if they say 2% will die, they're saying the same exact thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I can tell they're on the left side of the political spectrum, and I'm almost always right, just because of those little signals where we're not even saying different things, but because you say it differently, the people who are reading your social media post will start to put you in these different boxes. And that's just one of many examples. But I think that's also kind of what's happening is there is a new rhetoric being formed, meaning there is like the online version of how we read each other in real life. But the problem is on social media, we're reading each other and making these assumptions based on way less information.
Yeah, we are doing that. And it seems like we're doing that because, we've been trained to by social media, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. So we're really just catering to what we have available to us. And unfortunately, a lot of people are gravitating more towards that than towards other actual, here and now human beings. But what you're talking about has also been around for a while, much longer than social media.
Mm-hmm.
Kenneth Burke, a prominent rhetorician in the 20th century, coined the term terministic screen.
Okay.
And basically what that is, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says, people look through the world through a particular lens, and based on the discourse in which they've been raised or whatever, they tend to select certain things and deflect other things, right? So, when some people look at the American flag, they select the military, right? they may deflect equality, and liberty and all that stuff. Colin Kaepernick, deflects the military and liberty and things like that, and selects the hypocrisy, in America. They're looking at the same symbol, and all those things may be true, right? Regarding America, all those things are true.
Yeah.
It's not like somebody's making something up, but some people choose to look at some things and not others, and others choose to look at the other things and push away the other stuff. So we have different deterministic screens that we use to look at the world, and one can discern, I guess, political affiliation based on what people select and deflect.
We use those screens to sort each other into these boxes we talked about earlier. These boxes where essentially we have a box of humans and a box of non-humans that we get to if you're in the non-human box, meaning you are a bigot, you are a racist, you're a homophobe, you're whatever that box you've been put in, that it's okay to treat the entities in that box like anything you want, because you then get to, and this is the other aspect I'd like to get your take on, that I think that brings us to the next level, is if you then are seen as hitting hard those horrible people that you've put in that box on social media, you also know that your friends who are in your box can see you doing that, and they then see you as a hero. You are attacking the bad people on behalf of all the good people.
Yeah.
So it's performative.
It's performative. It's grandstanding. It's virtue signaling. There's several terms for it, but yes, yeah. It's the concept of the open letter, right? You're writing to one person, but you're really writing to everybody,
right?
Letter from Birmingham jail that MLK penned. He was writing to the clergy, but he was really writing to America, right? When you're grandstanding like that on the internet, you're attacking this person, but you're really writing to all your friends, letting them know, that you're down. Right? So yes, it is. A lot of this is performative.
Yeah,
and it's a shame.
Yeah, it is, because it takes away I guess, the beautiful individuality of each person who might be involved in the conversation. So in other words, if you were having a conversation with someone, it's actually one of the reasons that I love podcasting, just because it is social media driven, but in order to have the conversation, we have to leave social media and just have, obviously it would be better if you were here, in my studio and we were talking in person, we'd even be a higher resolution conversation. But this is a whole lot better than just tweeting back and forth.
Yes.
Partly because no one's going to interrupt us and jump in and tell us why one of us is, wrong or whatever. And maybe maybe we both said something today that's been wrong, but we at least get to continue the conversation, which I think is really important, because, even if two people are talking and sharing their ideas, and somebody says something that's wrong, you and I both will come out of a conversation having heard some perspective that we've never heard before, and therefore we come out of the conversation richer. And I think that's one of the things that we're losing when these performative conversations happen. And I'm actually interested in how you think this might compare to another, since again I was wanting to ask some questions too about the way that this plays into my work as a teacher, but because I'm really sensitive to the way I communicate, in the sense that of course I want to be a good teacher, so I want to get concepts across, but at the same time I also want to be inclusive of my students. I want to make sure everybody feels important. I want to make sure that when they ask questions, they feel important, they feel valued, they feel like they're part of a team. You mentioned some of these real world rhetorical problems. And I know that you've got a book where you have written about one of the ones that you are the most passionate about, it sounds like, which is that the way we talk about race is, as a society, is rhetorically toxic. I'm just going to that's my term, I guess. And it sounds like you feel that and you see that too. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that does not mean you don't think that we should ever talk about race. It's just that you were concerned about with the way we talk about it.
Oh, definitely. Yes, we
Okay.
should talk about race. Racism hasn't gone away
Right.
by any means. But yeah, as you said, the way we talk about it is doing more harm than good, for various reasons. For one thing, we talk about it as if it's 50 years ago,
Mm.
and we talk about it as if it is a primary obstacle in all our lives. I mean, it can be an obstacle, but it could be one of many as well. What's more, we put different emphases on certain aspects or certain incidents of racism. For example, if I'm in traffic and I look over and somebody screams the N-word at me, right? Um, I'm like, well, that dude's an asshole, right? And,
Yeah.
and there are people who would see that and then go and organize a 10-block march, with picket signs and things like that. There are certain things. Listen, you can't get rid of awful people,
Mm-hmm.
right? Nor can you police people's thoughts. What you can do is create policy so that those awful people can't get in the way of your progress, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's we've done that. We're doing that. It's not perfect, but I think we're progressing. And that guy in traffic who called me an N-word, is he my boss? Is he my landlord? Is he the mayor? No, he's just some schmuck I'll never see again. Who cares?
Mm-hmm.
I don't care what he thinks. I'm gonna go to my, excellent life. I'm driving to my wonderful life that I love, and he's probably not. And even if he is driving to a life he loves, so what? It has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with my dreams. It has nothing to do with what I want to do in life.
Mm.
A lot of people just don't know how to pick their battles, in my opinion. And some people will take microaggressions. You don't have to say the N word. You just have to, look at somebody wrong. You're a problem.
Right.
So yeah, so I think the way we talk about it, the way we approach it, is problematic. But I think we should approach it. We should talk about it.
Yeah.
You know,
Now,
um,
what are some of those those things that you think are problematic with the way that race is discussed? Just so that my listener, because I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most of my listeners um, will have no idea what you're talking about, in the sense that they're, most of the people who listen to this show are pretty invested in diversity, equity, inclusion type things, because on the surface, those are things that we all care about. And they are, but they know, my audience already knows that I have concerns also with how we talk about these things. But from your perspective, what are some things, maybe just a couple specific examples of things you see or hear or read that you go, whoa, this is not going to make things better?
well, just the idea that racism is irredeemable. If you have white skin and you're privileged in a lot of ways, that you are inherently oppressive, inherently a problem, and you need to constantly genuflect in order to make up for that, because it is an irredeemable sin, your skin.
Hmm.
Um, Obviously, that's an issue. What's more, it infantilizes people of color, right? If your mere presence, is suffocating me, as one of my colleagues once said, then how weak am I? I mean,
Right.
geez, man. Robin DiAngelo, her white fragility, it basically says that black people are infantilized children who need us to basically take care of them and protect them from the bad people, from us. We need to protect them from us, which makes me feel like I have no agency.
Right.
We feel like a child, and I am very much not that. But nevertheless, these are the kind of things that are being put forth. And I don't know. There's a lot going on
Right.
contemporary
Well,
anti-racist.
okay, so I'll be the devil's advocate just a little bit because, of course, I've read White Fragility, and um, I let's just say I read White Fragility and Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, all within a month of each other, and her book, I couldn't wrap my mind around any of it. Whereas Kendi's book, I actually enjoyed reading. I disagreed with a bunch of stuff in it, but
Right.
as I say, I also read the entire Bible when I was 12, and I disagreed with stuff. So
I was 15, but yes.
it's like, if I'm going to disagree with stuff in the Bible as a fundamentalist Christian kid, I'm going to disagree with Kendi. I'm sorry, he doesn't get my 100% adoration. But I guess my point is, the thing with the D'Angelo take on it is, I think she would disagree with your framing. Obviously, she's not going to say, "Oh yes, I believe that Black people are children and that they need me to save them and the white savior." She's not going to acknowledge that. But what I would say is that she does, the way she's written that book, again, rhetorically. So it's not what she's saying, it's how she's saying it. Is that if white people don't do a certain thing, XYZ, follow the prescription that she's putting out, then Black people can't be okay. And so to me, as somebody who tries to think about these things deeply, I see what you're saying, which is that to a Black person who also would read that as a deep thinker, and they would say, wait a minute, so for me to be okay, I've got to wait for that white guy over there
Right.
to do what he needs to do so that I can move along with my life. I'm not waiting for him.
Right.
Do you feel like, is that a fair framing?
That is a fair framing. And let me try to be fair to D'Angelo, who I critique often. White fragility, as she describes it, is a thing. I mean, white people don't like talking about racism. When white people say something blatantly racist and they don't know it and they're called out on it, it bothers them.
I
So that
absolutely
is a
agree. I
you
absolutely
know
agree. As a white, I will confirm that is a thing that many white people are really nervous or concerned about talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
right. So she's right about that. That we need to suck it up and have these conversations. But my agreement with her tends to end there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And there are a lot of things she says within and without that book. She has several tenets of anti-racist education. One being that the question isn't whether racism happened or not; it's how it manifested in that situation.
So the
Right?
assumption that it's always there.
It's always there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If it and this I see this in my field all the time. If a Black person says something and a white person says, "I don't understand. Can you explain that?" That's bad. That's inherently racist.
In what way?
A white person questioned a Black person.
Oh,
How dare he?
okay.
I'm not exaggerating. I can show you the emails.
I'll go back and delete all of my questions from this interview, and we'll just post you talking. How about that?
Exactly. So yes, I wish I could say that was an exaggeration, but it isn't by any means. So things like that are just doing a little bit too much.
Yeah. So do you think that maybe the concern would be that, from your perspective, and I don't want to put more words in your mouth, but this is just kind of what I think I hear you saying, is that the focus on the topic or on the issue in the way that we're doing it and how much we're doing it is creating possibly new communication problems that weren't there before, in the sense that now we've got two groups coming into a room with eggshells, instead of maybe just scattered eggshells here and there. So now you've got a concept where, like, a Black person might come into a room also concerned about how some of these conversations will go. Even if you take D'Angelo at her kind of premise, which is that white people already were concerned about these conversations, that just kind of spreads the nervousness and the I've got to say everything exactly right to the nth degree, to the point where natural conversation, some of the tough conversations that we're always told we're supposed to have, those are actually getting harder to have because people are afraid to step over a line.
Yes, I mean, I think that white people are afraid to step over a line.
Yep.
And I think there are a lot of Black people who are drawing arbitrary lines when they see fit. Now, there are, like I said, racism still around. It happens.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have certain situations, like the concept of harm that's been broadened, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having a person not agree with you isn't harm necessarily,
Right.
right? But it has become that. And I was at a conference about a month ago, and the issue of Piers Morgan criticizing Meghan Markle, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Yeah. Fill us in on that story because I don't know the details of that one.
Well, she complained, with the prince about, what's going on in Buckingham Palace, and Piers was like, "How dare she say that? I mean, she's exaggerating, things like that." And people said, "Oh, racism. He's white, she's Black.
Mm,
Got to be racism."
right.
And I'm watching a panel with academics, and they're saying, "Of course it was racism. He's white, she's Black. Of course it was." Not knowing that this guy says what he wants when he wants to say it. I mean, this guy isn't new. He's
Right.
been, he says what's on his mind.
He goes after everybody.
He goes after everybody.
Yeah. Right.
So it wasn't necessarily a racist statement, but they were certain simply because white man, Black woman.
Got it. Okay, so it sounds like, all right, so it sounds like one other issue that you're highlighting here is that while racism does exist, racism is depending on where you are in the world, more or less prevalent, but that it's almost never going to be the one reason why something happens. Like maybe
Right.
it would be more accurate to say, kind of like in the D'Angelo book, how she talks about how did it manifest itself in the situation. Maybe instead we would say things like, to what extent was racism involved in this situation, or was racism involved in this situation? Yes or no, and if so, to what extent?
Right.
This to me seems like a much healthier way to talk about racism.
Well, it's a more rhetorical way if you take the available means of persuasion thing into consideration. Context,
Mm,
context changes meanings of things. It changes, what certain words mean. It changes intent and impact and things like that. And we want this one size fits all way of dealing with racism, and that's just not realistic, nor is it ethical.
but you need
Yeah,
you need that one size fits all to fit in tweets.
yeah, right, right.
Yeah.
It's shorthand. It's a shortcut to thinking,
Hmm.
which is not good for situations like this, if ever.
Right.
So yeah, you have to look at the situation and act accordingly. And people aren't doing that. They want this magic bullet that can explain everything at all times, and that's not the way the world works.
Right. So tell us a little bit about your books more specifically. What's it called? What inspired you to write it? Where can we find it?
I just did a presentation for UC Riverside, so I have it right here.
Oh, cool.
A critique of anti-racism in rhetoric and composition, the semblance of empowerment. So what a lot of anti-racist activists, scholars in my field think they're doing is empowering students of color when actually they're disempowering students of color because they're painting them as victims who have no agency. They're also insisting that they know what their students of color are thinking. And a handful of people are speaking for 50 million people, which I think is odd.
Yes.
Uh, but it's acceptable and it's applauded, right? I mean, if a white guy said, "Okay, I'm going to tell you about every white person," right, and then he talks and half the stuff he says you disagree with, you're probably going to have a problem with that.
And people would laugh at that statement.
And people would laugh at that statement. A
Yep.
Black guy does it, everybody takes it seriously.
Yep.
That's a problem.
Which if I could be so bold, I would call that racism.
So would I.
In fact, I would, all the things that the anti-racist movement pulls on, like the socialization, the way Black people are portrayed in the media, the way that Black people are portrayed in rap and hip hop music and all those types of things in sports, all those stereotypes that I think are right to criticize, those are the stereotypes that make us believe someone when they say that this is what Black people think.
Right.
Because why? White people like me who are 40s in our 40s, we grew up seeing what Black people are like, and I'm putting my air quotes for the people watching on YouTube. What Black people are like. We've been taught that that's a thing, and I think it's racism because as a white person, no one's taught you what I'm like. I get to be seen, and I think this is a valid criticism. I've heard social justice activists make this criticism, which I think is valid, which is I get to be an individual because of the way white people are portrayed, in that we are widely varied and have been for 50 years in TV and movies, whereas Black people are portrayed as a certain stereotype. And I don't know, maybe that's crazy, but I see parallels there in our ability now to believe someone when, like you say, a Black academic who claims to be able to speak for all Black people.
I wrote an article for Ario that basically said what you just said. White guys are allowed to be individuals,
Mm-hmm.
right? And Black people are the Borg from Star Trek. We're just all the same drones, right? Thinking the same, acting the same, responding to stimuli the same. Things like that, and that is a problem. But a lot of people, they perpetuate that idea because they don't know any better, because they're narcissistic and want to, paint everybody in their image, or they're opportunists. To be quite frank, they realize that people see Black people as a certain way, so they're going to, harp on that and see what we can get out of it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to name names, but I know people who have that attitude.
I guess the incentives in a lot of ways in this conversation have been perverted,
Yeah.
in that we are not incentivized right now to get along or to find some type of reconciliation on the topic of race, that's where a lot of my concern about this topic comes from, is that I actually genuinely want things to be better. And I don't see any way for us to make it better if this is how we talk about the topic.
I think anti-racism in my field anyway, and academia at large, perhaps, it abides by what I'm calling in the book a primacy of identity, which is, it neglects context, like we were talking about before.
Okay.
That's just all for certain. It essentializes people of color as essentially victims, right? And that have been wronged to the point where we need to, treat them a certain way that we don't treat other people, right? Teaching in English that is deemed standard, right, is inherently racist, because how dare you ask people of color to write isn't instead of ain't? That's racism, right? I wish I could say I was kidding.
But white Southerners say ain't too.
Right. You're, it doesn't make sense.
Right.
There's no, it doesn't make sense. There's a inherent narcissism to it. You're not considering your audience when speaking. You're speaking to, present yourself. It's expression and nothing more. It's not persuasion anymore. It's expression. Mm-hmm. I am fill in the blank, hear me roar. That's the point of speaking or writing, right? And these things are doing more harm than good to people who come to our classes to learn a certain way of writing. That doesn't mean they're giving up their identity. They're not doing that, right? They're learning something that might come in handy at some point in their lives when they have to, write for work or for whatever, right? To people they don't know. I'm not even speaking about oral communication. I'm speaking specifically about writing. It may be a good thing.
Yeah.
And there's also this idea of prefiguration, which is how the very short version is that you are basically you create a world with an insular community, and you just decide to live in that world. You don't, go outside of that world. Outside of that world is reality, where people, just live their lives and write emails in a certain way because that'll be best for the person reading it, or to persuade the person reading it or something like that. They just stay in their bubble and live as if this is the real world, and academia is becoming that bubble,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that's doing more harm than good as well. I'll stop there.
No, it's good. I agree, and I feel like the disempowerment that I'm concerned about in this conversation is not only, well, it's really every student that I teach, but my Black students in particular, and I have a good number of Black students that I just, pardon my French, but I'll be damned if in my classroom, even if I'm well intentioned, that they will think that for something that happened in the past, they are somehow less capable
Mm,
to do what all the other students do. Like that to me that would be the height of racism. For me to assume that I teach music, right? You teach writing. If I'm asking a student to sing something by Mozart, I am also not asking them to give up their identity.
right.
They're going to learn a style, and then they're going to learn how powerful it makes them feel to be able to try that style and then go try something else.
May I ask, um, is any of this affecting music right now? I mean, I know some stories. I've heard some
Oh
stories.
man, oh
Yeah.
man, we are super woke.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I've heard stories. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a huge thing in our profession, and and I think the typical music teacher understands that what I'm saying right now, which is that no, we do want all of our students, no matter what skin color they have, to be exposed to as many types of music from as many places in the world as possible, especially if you're in a classroom setting. That's kind of an important aspect. Like to me, diversity in music programming is pretty inherent, because it would be boring at a concert to have it be all Mozart.
Yeah.
But you do Mozart, and maybe there's a gospel piece, and maybe there's something from a Native American culture, and there's maybe something from an Arab culture, and that might all happen on the same concert. But for some reason, I think because of this sensitivity that you and I have been talking about right now with Black-white issues, that the issue creeps up all of a sudden when it's Black and white music, and how those things are centered in the curriculums. And so, of course, I'm all for diversifying curriculums, but I think my concern comes in with this messaging, this rhetoric that you and I have been talking about tonight, of whether or not students of color are being taught that they are beautiful, powerful, able to overcome the things that have happened in the past. Are they the things happened to your ancestors, and maybe they were done to you by my ancestors, but that means nothing to you going forward, because we are going to help build a better world together. And I wish that was the message, but it just isn't.
No, it's not. And it's this idea of things are being driven by resentment,
Hmm.
right? And not a growth mindset moving forward or things like that. What's more, there's this assumption that students are coming to classroom deficient of dignity, right? And self-esteem. Um, I didn't need my writing professor to give me permission to be proud to be Black.
Hmm.
I was there already. I needed my writing professor to tell me how to use a semicolon. And that's that. And there's this assumption that we need to coddle the Black kids because they're just so injured and broken, right? And I hate that.
Yeah, and even if there are some Black kids that are injured, meaning that there would be, because as we talked about before, we both acknowledge that racism exists and it happens. There could be a Black kid in our classrooms that was injured by racist experiences. It doesn't change the fact that that it's still not good for that kid to teach them they can't overcome it.
Right. And I had several racist experiences happen to me before I, walked into a classroom or a college classroom or something like that. It wasn't that, again, I was there to get an education, and I would handle that other stuff on my own. I didn't need my writing teacher to say you can write however you want. All right, just you write however you want.
Right. Meanwhile, the teacher then would be going over with a fine-tooth comb the white kid's paper and finding all of the errors, and that's also racist.
Yeah, and I have to go soon, but I'll end on this.
Yep.
There's a chapter in the book in which I talk about somebody who wrote an essay. He published this essay saying that he was doing the woke pedagogy, and in his student evaluations, the kids were like, this guy thinks this white dude is trying to keep us down by not teaching us the standard English, and black teachers told him about it, and he was just like, wow, they just don't get it. They just don't get it. These students, these professors, yeah, they're not as woke as I am. That was basically the point of this article. So I had to talk about that in the book.
Yeah. That's a brilliant turn of phrase, because that is kind of what's going on. That's kind of what's going on. Well, I don't want to keep you any longer, but I will definitely plug your book in the show notes, and I'll find links to it and all of that. I really appreciate your time and shedding some light on these tricky topics and concepts for us.
Thank you for having me. It's always good to have an opportunity to talk.
Thanks, as always, for sticking around to the end of an episode. For many, that might have been a very uncomfortable conversation. However, I think uncomfortable conversations are important, which means that if we don't talk to each other, if we don't include the parts of the conversation that we wish weren't out there, then no one will learn anything. Ultimately, that's how we learn. We learn everything through conversation. If you really think hard about that statement, you'll find that it's true. We learn everything through conversation. Even myself as a musician, I learn music through musical conversation with other musicians. I create music, I send it out into the world, and people send me back feedback. That is a conversation. Our brains cannot learn in a vacuum. You can't sit there and dream up a fantasy world and then expect it to come true. You have to bounce your ideas off of other people. Iron sharpens iron, after all. So this was an uncomfortable conversation for many, I'm sure, but I found it fascinating. This is where my head lives. I'm interested in talking to scholars. I'm interested in talking to people who study this stuff for a living, to gather my input and then, of course, present it to you. And I hope you find it valuable. If you do, like, share, leave comments. Head over to the Choralospers Facebook group. It is a place you can have some conversations about this. Now, if you're listening to this and you're not a music person, that's okay. You can find me on Twitter at Chris Muntz, all one word. You can also send me an email, choralosophy@gmail.com, and give me some feedback. Thanks a lot. Thanks for listening.